All right, good evening. I guess we better get going. Depending on which clock you look at, we're either right on time or 2 minutes late. So I guess we'll go right on time. That make me feel better about it. Before we get going this evening, we're gonna have a prayer. Does anybody have anything additional, any kind of request or people we need to add? Okay. Oh, Glenn. Yeah, Glenn grew. Did he really? I didn't know that. Okay, Glenn. Oh. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. If there's nothing else, then can't hear it back there. Yeah, they said they can't hear in the back there. Oh, speaker's not working, maybe. How about that? Is that better? Okay, I think so. Okay, let's open with a prayer then. Okay, we're going to be in chapter 12 tonight. There are some handouts back there. I made doubly sure this week when I sent the email that I had the right one. Because last week I sent the wrong one. So they are back there, chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, if you want one, if you'd like to have one. Or if not, then, you don't have to have one, but they're there if you want it. We've got 2 more weeks and 1 more chapter after this. I think what we're going to do next week is the latter part of chapter 12 will be a separate lesson, I think, or either that or we'll have 2 out of chapter 13. Or I thought about, and I don't know if this would be beneficial or not, kind of doing like a connect the dots lesson where we went back and put together. This book we've seen a bunch of places where something is mentioned previously, then it's picked up later, then it's compounded on later. Maybe come together and do a lesson where we just look at the entire book and put them all together, maybe make connections between the whole book. So I don't know yet how I'll go about it, but if you got some input, that would be great. After class, let me know. But I think either one of those would be great because chapter 12 is really a powerful chapter, and so is chapter 13. It may not be some of the ones that we've studied the most out of like sermon types, but tonight these lessons or these verses are ones that we'll be very familiar with. You've heard it many times, and so we'll look through that and discuss it, and hopefully be encouraged by it. It's really a great study, the book of Hebrews, and I've enjoyed our time together in it. But what we're going to do is read the first 15 verses of Hebrews 12, and then we're going to discuss really verses 4 through 15 a little bit. 4 through 17 a little bit. And then after that, we're going to come back and spend the rest of our time focusing on the first three verses of the chapter. So it says, therefore, this is in Hebrews 12, verse 1, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? Okay, the no root of bitterness, this is in verse 15. No root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. That there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. For you know that even afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no place for repentance, though he sought it with tears. And so those verses there, it's talking about a father's discipline. But within the context of Hebrews, what have we been discussing primarily? It's the persecution or the trouble that they're facing, or some have faced already. We read there in chapter 10 that some have already faced severe consequences, and the threat is there. And really that's what the letter has been about, is don't go back to the other way because of the trouble that is potentially there, or that you may be facing. But what do you think about how the writer here is really equating this persecution to discipline? How do we understand that? The suffering, really, I guess you might say, that's really kind of, when you read it in context, it's hard to imagine that the hard things that we might go through might be for our own good or to make us better in some way. But that's not this is not the only place in Scripture where we see that, is it? In James chapter 1, James talks about count it all joy when you fall into various, he says, temptations or trials or tribulations. And then in Romans chapter 5, Paul has a similar message about how, the things that we might go through in this life can make us better. And I think that may be the attitude that the writer is really pointing toward here, because if they're facing a lot of problems, a lot of outside noise, and a lot of trouble that could possibly persuade them to go back to the old ways, then their mindset is not correct, or they must have the correct mindset to withstand those things. If they see it as something that is potentially going to turn out or will turn out for their own good, then I think that may be the key to those particular verses. And, the first verse that we read in verse 4, you have not resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. And then you go down to the last couple verses where we see, in verse 16, or verse 15, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled, and there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. If you know that even afterwards, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, so he sought it with tears. What do we know? What kind of comparison can we make with Esau there and then the situation that the Hebrews Christians might be going through? I mean, think about that. Esau, when he came in from the field, he was hungry, right? And he traded his birthright for temporary relief of the problem that he had. His problem was he was hungry, and he traded something great for something that fixed the problem in the moment, but it caused long-standing problems for him, and it was something that he couldn't come back from. And so you think about really what these Christians are facing, and not just them, but all Christians since then, even to us, and even till now. You may have persecutions, you may have challenges, you may have troubles in life. And the short-term fix that fixes and stops the immediate problem might be to leave the Lord and go back into the world or back into your former way of life or walk of life. But that's a short-term fix with long-term trouble. You trade something very valuable and something very wonderful for short-term relief. When everything that we've read about in this letter up until now, or so many places that we've read, is don't go back, or those warnings that we've read. And then even tonight, what we're going to study there in those first 3 verses is about endurance. It's about carrying on. It's about running the race all the way until the end. And so if you were running a race and you got about to mile 10 out of 26, so you're running a marathon, and then you had some kind of physical problem, you think, I'm just going to quit right here. I'll just stop, and somebody will come by and pick me up, and I'll try again next time. But really, the ideal scenario would be, if you could, to just keep going, to finish the race. And I think maybe that is going to be comparative to what we're going to study tonight. Does anybody have any comments on these verses before we get into those first few? I don't mean to rush through those. We may touch on those again next week. I just don't want to not have time to finish our sheet tonight. No, that's right. You don't need to burn any bridges at all. Short term, what seems right, think it through and be wise. Okay, the first 3 verses of this chapter are some of the ones that are very familiar to us. And I know you've read them. You may have them memorized even, and probably heard many sermons on it. but they're just so strong, and they fit in and they relay the message to us. This whole section that we're in right here. But in chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." And so this passage is coming off of that great chapter that we studied last week, chapter 11, all those wonderful examples of faith. We talked about how many times those words, by faith, are found in that chapter. And then everything, the people who are mentioned, Abraham, Moses, Abel, Sarah, on and on and on. You have these great examples of faith. And even those that come past them, there in verse 37 talks about all the things that they endured. In verse 38, men of whom the world was not worthy. That is in chapter 11. So that just tells you about the quality of these people and the faith that they had in God and the things that they accomplished and endured and remained faithful all the way through to the end. And those last couple verses, 39 of chapter 11, "And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God has provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect." No pressure. These didn't get what we have. They didn't have the opportunity that we have, living on this side of the cross. When the Hebrew writer writes these things to Hebrew Christians, you have to know that with a Jewish background, they most likely grew up, they're very familiar with the stories of the people that was mentioned in chapter 11. And they mean a lot to us. I know they meant a lot to them as well. I mean, if you grew up going to church, even now, that was from the time you were small on up. These are the people that you've looked to, learned about, and studied about. And so you're very familiar with them. And so when he says here in chapter 12, verse 1, "So great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us." And that's the first blank there on your sheet, witnesses. It says, "So great a cloud of witnesses." Now, most people believe, and it's pointing backward here, that these great examples of faith are the witnesses. So it's like if you are gathered to a sporting event or you're going to compete in some kind of race, that, there's people who come to see you in the stands. I know that when I was a child, it's been a long time since I played, a sport or anything. Those years were way back there. But you think about when you were maybe playing some sport as a child, or even now when your children play, if you have children, and people are going to come to see you because they care about you. And you're going to be out there playing ball or running a race. I remember, being in elementary school, we had field day, and we had run relay races and all this. But, man, we were practicing, getting ready, because, the last thing you want was them to show up and you didn't do well. You wanted to win. And everybody's watching, so you want to do well. And you think about this great crowd of witnesses. All these people that we mentioned in chapter 11, and what they went through and what they endured and how they served God. And then if they're watching us some kind of way, or if their life is a witness, I don't know exactly how we would put this into play. I don't know that they're like watching us, but I think their example for sure stands as like a stands full or bleachers full of people that you really want to impress. These are giants of the faith. People who have done very, very well and been very, very faithful in the face of all kinds of problems and circumstances. They're not like a hostile crowd. Everybody in the South, it seems like everybody's got a football team they pull for. Everybody's got a favorite, but when you flip the TV on Saturday, if you're playing at another, if it's an SEC team and you're playing at another stadium, it's always a hostile environment. You know, there's always a lot of yelling and carrying on, and they're booing, and that's not the crowd. The crowd is like more like, you know, your family and friends sort of a crowd, of people who want you to do well. And so we're going to run this race, and there's a great cloud of witnesses, and I wouldn't want to be embarrassed by my conduct or my lifestyle or my dedication in front of them, would you? I mean, if they could see, or I don't know, like I said, in what context they are this crowd of witnesses, but it sounds like they're, if nothing else, their example of faith is watching you, if that makes sense. And I don't want to live my life in such a way or fall short in a way that kind of embarrasses myself in front of great people like this. You know, we talked last week even about great examples of faith in our own life in the church here, or churches, maybe if you grew up somewhere else and ended up here, and those people, I remember when I was a child, teenager especially, you know, I was always concerned about embarrassing my parents. Is anybody else like that? Back then, it was like I didn't really care what people thought about me, but if I was afraid I was going to do something that embarrassed them, man, you talk about feeling small, because I knew how they were and how they lived their life, and how, you know, they tried to do all the right things, and they were good people, and I didn't want to do anything to embarrass them. And so when you think about this crowd of witnesses from that aspect, it really brings into light the importance of our Christian life, because of the people who have come before us, the people who are around us now. I mean, how do you feel about that? Does that make you want to, I mean, if you ever feel like you want to not give it 100%, but if you knew they were watching, would it change the way you lived your life? I think it does. I think it would. If you considered these verses at that time, you know, sometimes we have little times in our life maybe where it's harder than it is at other times, but I don't want to let them down. And we need to be prepared to do our best and continue on. And so in order to do that, he says, you know, we have this great cloud of witnesses surrounding us. Let us lay aside every, and this translation says encumbrance. Well, that word encumbrance, I think I put it there on the study sheet. It's a weight or a mass or an encumbrance. It's basically anything that can hold us back or weigh us down so that we can't run the race like we should. You know, the next blank I have on the sheet there, I think, is lay aside everything that would hinder us. You think about how something could slow us down or cause us problems. You know, in Romans 13, verse 12, Paul said, "The night is almost gone and the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light." So we're going to get rid of our old ways. We're going to get rid of those sinful aspects of life and then put on the armor of light. Those good things that we read about there in the scriptures, or Ephesians 4, 22 through 24, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind and put on the new self, which is the likeness of God, or in the likeness of God, has been created in the righteousness and holiness of truth. So it's like taking off something that's weighing you down and putting on something better. Could you imagine running a race wearing one of those big, heavy, I just had this thing in my mind, like these big Eskimo coats. You know what I'm talking about? Big old heavy coat with a big hood. And could you imagine running a race and something like that? It would slow you down, weigh you down. It's overbearing. You can't move good. You get too hot. It's just not what you would wear. Instead, you would remove that. So in the same way, like the sin or everything else, maybe whatever might hold us down, getting rid of those things, removing those things. Sometimes in life we have to prune back some stuff. Something that may hamper us or distract us. Maybe it's not even, and we're going to talk about sin in a second, but maybe it's not even anything that's sinful, but it's something that just is preventing us or hurting us from doing the best that we can do, in our Christian life. I don't know, maybe, for each person it'd probably be something a little different, but maybe some habits that existed before, or even some friendships or relationships that you had before that there's always the danger of that holding you back or pulling you back. And maybe you just have to say, well, you know what, I'm going to have to remove those things and then just focus on the task at hand. We have to identify for ourselves whatever might be holding us back. That's got to be an individual thing we think through, examine our lives and think about, are there things that are preventing us from doing our best, as Christians? Living the best that we can, or running the race in the way that we should. Because those things, he said, we need to lay aside, remove all of those things, and then prepare to run. Has anybody got any comments here? Okay. Well, the next blank is remove. We're going to remove the sin that may be present in our lives. Sin, it shouldn't really be any doubt with that. I mean, living a life as a Christian, those things that sometimes when you first become a Christian, and I guess maybe not even when you first become a Christian, sometimes even later on when you've been a Christian for a while, there may be little sins, that are just sort of hang around. Maybe you do fine with it for a little while. Then sometimes it's like, well, that's fine, really. It's okay. I know it's price. Try to reason it out, try to weigh it out. We want to keep it around if we can because we like it. We want it to be part of our lives, but then we know it shouldn't be, but we're not really ready to get rid of it. Well, the writer here says you need to remove it. Remove it. Get it out of your life. Don't let it be a part of your life because it does so easily entangle us. And what happens if you're running a race and you get tangled up? You're going to lose. Yeah, you're going to fall. It's not going to be good. You're going to get skin up pretty bad, and it's going to hurt, and you may or may not get back up. It depends on how hard you hit. You can get back up most likely, but sometimes you hit really hard and you just don't want to get back up again. And so, our race is a race that is of faith. Faith in a God who sent the Son of God, a part of God, to live in the flesh, which we've discussed in this letter, and die on the cross to remove sin. All that to get rid of sin. And so to kind of keep it around and not really be serious about removing it, that just doesn't make sense. Really. Why would you maintain sinful things in life and try to find a way to make it okay? If it's wrong, just go ahead and get rid of it. Remove it, because eventually it's going to trip you up and cause you problems. So we just can't engage in that any longer. It's just going to cause us to fail. Okay, so the race requires, and this is the next blank I have, endurance. Now, we talked about that already a little bit. We've touched on it. This has been a pretty big theme so far in the book of Hebrews because of the warning passages and also because of the other passages like chapter 10 and verse 36, where he says there, if you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. Endurance, keep on keeping on. Steadfastness, patience, taking it all the way to the end. It's been, it just can't be stressed enough, I suppose, because it's been stressed so many times. Let's just say we're running a race or competing in some kind of event, and maybe we're watching football on Saturday, and your quarterback is having a great game, but the game is close, but he's playing really well. And he gets about midway through the fourth quarter and says, I think I need to take a break. And he just goes and, take me out. And he just goes, sits on the bench for a little while. That if he stops then and you lose, what does he gain? The rest of the game that he played is just lost. And so we think about like the endurance needed in our Christian life. You may be doing really, really well for years, and then somewhere along the way you decide, you know what, I'm just done. I've seen that scenario in real life. You probably have too, where someone was faithful for many, many years, and then something happened when they were older, and they just quit.
Endurance involved. You got to get involved in to continue doing what you're doing.
To remain apart.
There's something out there you can do.
I do think you're onto something there too. If you feel disconnected or not a part of what's going on, you can easily just quit coming.
You see people talk to people sometimes that don't really speak coming back towards the church. And you say something to them, and they'll say, well, no, nobody ever speak to me. But you got to go out of your way to be kind and loving toward the brothers and sisters in Christ. Now, those kind of people that feel like that they're an outsider, even though they may come every Sunday, but those are the ones we got to watch about being faithful later on in life, because they hadn't put anything into it. They hadn't tried to run the race. They hadn't tried to keep the faith.
Yeah, sometimes the situation is really difficult and people struggle. You don't even know it. They may be struggling with their faith, and challenges come, and it's easy then it's harder to quit running if other people are around you helping you. I think it's kind of what you're getting at there. And if you're alone, if you feel like you're running it alone or doing anything that you're doing alone, you can reason it out with yourself that you can just quit, and go a different way or stop. But if you have other people who are counting on you, and we just read about that in chapter 10, exhort one another more and more, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together. So all of that, is all tied in together. Being a part of something bigger than yourself, and then holding others, sort of holding you accountable in a sense that they're counting on you to continue on with them, to be here, to be involved in things that are going on, and then to run it with them because they need your help. So yeah, I think that's great. Okay, so the next thing there we have is that the race is set before us. We may have not really thought about that so much before, but God has laid it out. The life that we must live. And that really, in this context, is through the example set by those people who we read about in chapter 11. That faithful cloud of witnesses that came before us, and not just them, but through the work of Christ. So we have a course to follow. Christ is our example. We're not out here paving the way, charting new territory. This has already been done before us. We're just sort of following the example that they have left. God has put it out there. He showed us what has to be done. He's shown us how that you accomplish it. I do a lot of, if YouTube University gave out degrees, I'd have one. If you fix things around the house, you just watch enough videos. If you see enough people doing things already in front of you, if you watch their example enough times, you can do it. And that's the same sort of thing that we have here, is that these people have already been down the same road. And Jesus went down the same road, and he did it like no other. And so we have a race, a course already set. We just follow the course that they have laid out. It's already been designated, and we just run it. We run it. And we run the race like Jesus. That's the next blank, like Jesus. Run the race like Jesus. Fixing our eyes on him. I love that term, fixing our eyes. I think about Peter, when he's walking on the water and he was looking at Jesus and he looked away. What happened? Oh, he started sinking. So Jesus reached out and got him. That's a great lesson there from that passage. But we're to keep our eyes on Jesus. He is the example that we've got to follow. And everywhere in this letter, in some way or another, it's been about Jesus and been about his superiority. He's better. He's the better way. All the better things that we talked about. Better than angels, better than Moses, a better covenant, better sacrifice, better high priest. All these things that we have discussed in the previous chapters leading up to this one. And he's provided the reason for our running. His sacrifice on our behalf on that cross should be enough right there for us to get into the race and complete the race. If we just look to him, think about him. Every Sunday morning, we gather around the table, and partake of the blood or the cup, the bread and the cup. And we think about Jesus. That's what it's for. In remembrance of me, he says. It has a very important purpose. We're reminded weekly of his coming, of his sufferings, of his faithfulness, and of his sacrifice. Put all those things together. Every week we think about it. And that should be to help us, encourage us. In 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, Paul talks about the Lord's Supper, and he talks about the commonality. And in chapter 10, he talks about a participation or sharing there, partaking the Lord's Supper. And so that commonality, looking to Jesus, we're in this thing together. We're in it with him, and we're keeping our eyes on him, fixing our eyes on Jesus. And so he is going to be the one that we follow. He's the reason that we're running, to be pleasing to God, and what God has displayed his great love for us. 1 John chapter 4, God is love, and he's made that love manifest or made it known through sending Jesus. It's all just great when you think about what's been done. So, why wouldn't you do it? Why wouldn't you get in there, run it, and run it well? And so these next two terms is really awesome to think about. The way that Jesus is mentioned here. Well, I really am interested in these next two terms. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher or perfecter of our faith. That doesn't really come across in English when you think about what does it mean he's the author of our faith. He's the, what does that mean? Well, that word that is translated there, you find it also in chapter 2, verse 10. And I should read that. I should have put it on my sheet. But in chapter 2, verse 10. You read it there. It talks about I think it says captain there. But there we see that, for it was fitting for him from whom are all things and through whom are all things, which is staggering, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. So the author of their salvation, the same word that we find here. It's a real interesting word. I did a little research on it, read some articles about it. But you see this term, it really has to do in a lot of ways with like a leader or the first person. I think one usage of the word outside of the scriptures was like if a person forges into new territory and they're the first one there and they make a city and they name the city after them. You know, probably in when you took state history, I remember, I went to school in Tennessee and was in Hardin County, and we learned about Colonel Joseph Hardin. That's who the county was named after him. So something early on, he came in and he did something. Anyway, the county's named after him. So he's sort of like the pioneer. He's like the one who has went first, the forerunner, the captain. And so this term, I'll read you a little bit. You can find it in a couple places. In Acts chapter 5 and verse 31. You find it again in the book of Acts. I'll find that verse in a minute. But, he's there to lead. He's the first one. He's the Prince of Salvation. He's just the first one, the Prince of Life, the Architect of Life. And so by his resurrection, Christians have the pledge. You remember what he says in John chapter 14? And I'm going to go find it. I'm going to go prepare a place for you. Why? So we can be with him. He's going on ahead so that we can go where he is. He's leading the way. He's forged the path. He's the author, the founder, we may say, of this faith that we have, the author and finisher of our faith. And so it really is a fantastic way to think about Jesus, who has went on ahead of us, forged the way, endured the things that these Christians may be suffering, and then some, and even more, but all the while remained faithful. And his goal was to please God and to do the will of the Father. And so because of what he's done, now we have access to God, and we can follow and be with him in the presence of God. So we know that this is the one that we need to follow. He's the reason that we have hope. Has anybody got any comments here? Mm-hmm.
And of course, it was perfect.
Yeah.
He was perfect. And because of that, we have perfection, but we're still sinners.
Yeah, he has brought it to pass, the faith. And so he has done it and done it well, done it correctly. And so we must continue to follow him. So we think about how he ran. Look at some of the things that are mentioned here right after that. Author and finisher, or author and perfecter, or originator and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. This is how he did it. Despising the shame, he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so he led the way. Now we may think about troubles, and that's been kind of the theme, underlying theme here in the book, is the problems that they may be potentially facing, or, don't go back because of persecution or problems. But he faced a lot of persecutions, not just the cross. I've thought oftentimes, and we have probably discussed it in this class already, maybe a little bit, but you think about what it would be like for Jesus, who came to save his people. But yet he was rejected in many ways. He was questioned. He was not believed. He was challenged. He was. They talked bad about him. Oh, he's devil. He's casting out demons by the devil. They defamed him every which way. Whatever they thought they could do to discredit him or get some kind of advantage on him, because they didn't want to lose their place. But Jesus endured all of those persecutions before he ever got to the physical persecution. And I think, when we read here in verse 4 of chapter 12, it says, "You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood." They hadn't killed you yet, or some of you, I would guess probably is what. But you may be facing you may be getting a lot of tension, a lot of heat from the community. People may be really treating you harshly, and probably facing economic challenges. We read that in chapter 10 that some people had lost their earthly possessions. If you go back to verse 34 of chapter 10, it talks about the seizure of your property. That had happened before. In some ways, and I don't know, it may depend on the person, but in some ways, it would be easier to confront a physical battle. If you knew you were going to get slapped in the face, for being a Christian, you could just be ready for it. But if the world just hammers you with insults, with demeaning conversation, with come up with little nicknames for you because you go to church or because you believe in the Bible, and then maybe at work you're not able to get a promotion, or they don't want to keep you around, and it costs you money. And all those things, are those things not similar? If it's because of your faith, what would you rather? Would you rather face some kind of physical something than just right away, or would you rather face a lifetime of that? I certainly wouldn't want to face the cross. Just clarify. But I'm talking about, maybe we may think of persecutions strictly in a physical sense, but that's not the only way that we would face it. And so that was the first spell. So let me move a little bit faster. So with endurance, now he faced the cross. And so everywhere here we find out we got to have endurance. Well, he endured all the way to the end. He endured the shame. He was hated without a cause. He didn't fit the mold that the world had set, and his people, the other Jews, had set. And instead of caving in to the demands of the religious leaders, he stood his ground and he followed God. He decided then that he was going to be what he should have been, and he kept that. He endured until the end. Very similar. We must have that same quality in our lives. And it was for the joy that was set before him, the joy of doing the Father's will and providing salvation for us as well. And he sat down at the right hand of God. He conquered. He overcame. He won. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to overcome this world. We're trying to overcome sin. We're trying to make it to that place where we're with God. Victory. There's a lot of that language in the book of Revelation about overcoming and being victorious. And so consider Jesus. So let's think about him. Let's consider him. Let's know and understand him. This word is used in a mathematical sense in some ways, where the readers are, and this is a quotation from another writer, says the readers are exhorted to weigh up carefully, which I think is a wonderful way of putting it. Weigh up carefully the endurance of Christ when contemplating their own hardships. Be wise. Think it through. Make the comparison. Weigh it out. Look at what Jesus did, and then look at our own lives, and he's going to come out on top. And so we must consider him and take that as our own example. And so the sinners, and this is, I think, maybe the last blank we have, is the opposite of witnesses. And so those witnesses we read about earlier on are there sort of, you get the sense they're for you. They're encouraging you. They're on your side. But the sinners who brought this hostility against Jesus is almost like that hostile crowd at the visiting stadium. They didn't want Jesus. He endured a lot from sinners here on this earth. But, those who were receiving this letter were facing maybe similar situations. And so it's very important. So in the face of persecution, they must continue on like Jesus. And so that we do not grow weary and lose heart. There in verse 3, it's just so that is the reason you will not grow weary and lose heart. So that you won't quit and give up. Get discouraged and stop. Think about Jesus. Focus on Jesus. Keep your eyes on Jesus. He's went ahead. He's already done it. Think about what he went through. Think about what he overcame. Think about what he did. Follow his example. Don't get discouraged and don't quit. In your Christianity, in your Christian life. And be encouraged instead of discouraged by those who have come before us, by the great examples that are there, all those that we studied about last week, but primarily by Jesus. Has anybody got any comments before we close out? I know we're right here at the end, so I guess we'll just go ahead and stop there. I think we're about to get the buzzer anyway. Thank you.